Hi there, I'm Sara Burns, and my business healing practice, I should say, is the Center for Sacred Transformations.org. And a little bit about my background. I have been doing Reiki since 1994. I stepped into a professional role with Reiki in 2006. And from 2006 until a little bit after the time of COVID, I taught two 12-week energy healing programs um, throughout those whole years. But after COVID, I did make a decision not to teach that anymore, but instead do one-on-one mentorships with people, custom designing what they need for their healing practice. So that's just a little bit about my background, but today I'm here to talk about the 5 elements. Now, I just did a series on this a couple of weeks ago on the origins of the 3 Reiki symbols. And the reason that was so important is because oftentimes in Reiki, what we hear is the history of where Reiki came from, but we don't really focus too much on the deeper meaning of the healing symbols. And I do feel that if you have a sense of understanding its origins, what it did for me is it guided me in how I created my energy healing programs. And it also guided me in how I focus my intention on working with other people. And one of the main things that comes out of those origins of symbols is that from the Eastern traditions, I particularly practice Buddhism primarily, but the idea is that the elements within our bodies, the 5 elements, when they're in balance, then we are at the place of achieving our life purpose, as well as having an opportunity to work more and more on our ability to obtain enlightenment. And so the goal of my practice in working with people, not that I'm going to get them to enlightenment in a number of sessions, but the idea still is to work on the elements that are out of balance. Now, one of the things I've noticed since I've been doing this for over, 15, 17, 18 years, is that I notice when people come in, there's a correspondence oftentimes with the conditions that can arise with the seasons, because the seasons are also corresponding with the elements as well. And so I'm not saying that every single person that comes in during a season has the same issue, but what I am saying is that there's themes that do show up at certain times of year. And right now we are in fall, and the element of fall can be called multiple things. In Chinese medicine, they refer to it as the metal element. Some traditions call it the ethers. We hear about that particularly with the chakra, the throat chakra. The ether begins there. And then in the Tibetan religions, they refer to it as space. I particularly like the term space because it alludes to a few things. It alludes to the expansiveness of our universe and having those gases within us expand our chest, allowing us to expand out and connect in the world. And space is also related to the upper worlds, and this is where we achieve our higher wisdom. However, so let me just explain Chinese medicine-wise. How did that become metal? Well, their idea about this is that with metal, when the moisture is removed from the elements, then all the other elements are in their more refined state to where they have mutability they're able to bend and move and whatsoever. However, if that moisture stays within the elements and resides in the lung region, which is the correspondence as well to fall, that metal can turn into rust. And so having that image of rust kind of gives you some impressions about the physical body as well as the emotions and behavior of an individual. So let me just give you some ideas about the correspondence of the lungs. And so just starting with the very basics, again, it's the metal element. But in 5-element theory, what we also have is a twin organ. We have what's called yin organs, which stores the energy of emotions and conditions. And we have also yang organs, which moves out the energy from those storage containers of energy within our organs. And so in the case of the lungs, what we're dealing with is the large intestines. And so I'm going to be talking about both of these here. And the key emotion that gets stored in the lungs is grief. And that's interesting because oftentimes the people that show up in fall have had issues about letting things go in their life, not being able to process the emotions of past losses in their life. And part of this can be just their behavioral pieces of them, that it's easier to just stay stuck. But on another level with grief, we need to realize in our culture that when you've had a death, oftentimes we're given permission to discuss that grief and act out processing our grief for maybe 3 days, maybe a week. But we have this unwritten rule that after a set period of time, it's really unacceptable for us to talk about our grief that we carry with us. And that can create a sense of isolation from the rest of the world. And that does show up energetically when I'm working on people. But the other piece of grief, let me just say, is that, let me define grief first of all, because it's not just about sadness. Grief is also about a rage that we tend to internalize. And so there's anger, rage, deep, deep sadness that if we don't have the ability to work out or process or talk out, that all stays within our own system. And what ends up happening with that energy, those emotions, is that it sits in the lung area and it will compress our chest areas as well as block our heart from being able to make connections with others in the world. And so that's the first thing I do want to talk about, is that when that's happening, because I'm empathic, I can experience it from across the room when somebody has massive lung imbalances or excess lung energy, because it really feels like you're bumping up against a wall. And you can't, it's difficult to make a connection with the person through their heart. And with that inability to make that connection, it can be difficult to communicate with them because they're not typically very open people. Or, on the other hand, they may be open, but they may have a very dry, cynical, sarcastic personality that allows you to only go so far without feeling like you're being judged. And that dryness equates again to the season of fall. You know, ideally it's good to have moisture in our atmosphere, but it tends to be more drying this time of year. And so having that kind of personality, it shows up environmentally in the weather. We see the dryness showing up because our plants are starting to die. The leaves on trees are turning from green to brown energy. And what that's also saying is that these things no longer serve us. They are dead, they're useless, they're waste. And so, what other behaviors can show up with that? So, one behavior that we can easily recognize that may be equated to grief is someone who hoards, somebody who can't let go of things in their life that no longer serve them. And I want to go back to talking about fall for a minute, because this time of year, on a physical level with the lungs, people tend to get a lot of respiratory issues. And those respiratory issues could be a calling for you to pull away from the world, and because your lungs are weaker and therefore you're more susceptible to a virus. But on an emotional level, that lung weakness is a calling for you to come back, pull within, and maybe reevaluate the past losses in your life. Maybe you don't feel as if you were able to get the support and love you needed while you were healing that wound. And so that time of illness is giving you that permission to kind of pull back and take care of yourself, and maybe do some reflecting when you're not active on the things that you still may need to work out or process in your life. And so the other issues that physically can show up this time of year is, because I mentioned the twin organ, large intestines, it can be very drying for the intestines as well. And not having that ability, well, to have constipation. And so with those things, what the messaging is also is that you've been having difficulties of letting things go. And it doesn't just necessarily need to be about death in the family. It could be about early childhood traumas that never got resolved, where maybe somebody hasn't been acknowledged for the grief that they suffered as a child for dealing with rageful family members or abuse, sexually or physically. They may have been programmed into not being able to talk about their traumas, which can also be stored as grief. And so other things that can occur this time of year is that you might be examining, the worthiness of the work that you're doing, where you're putting your energies in, and if those energies are actually serving you. Is your relationship growing, or has it become stagnant? Have you been working on projects that are just not going anywhere, or a career that's not going anywhere? Those types of things showing up in your thoughts at this time is a natural part of the process of the cycle of life. We need to take this time in fall to really do some evaluation about what is serving us, and what do we want to let go of in order for the next season to be able to plant seeds and to grow into something better than what has not been serving us. So this time of year is a really good time for that. Now, I mentioned earlier about death and how we're not able to speak about it, but yet this time of year we do have celebrations of Halloween, All Souls Day, and the Day of the Dead. And that is also an opportunity on a whole community-wide basis to honor what has been lost in our lives. And I would take advantage of that. You could do many things to calling your ancestors. And one of the things I'm going to encourage you to think about doing if you've had death in your family is to maybe at night before bed to call them to come into your dreams, because this is the time of year where the veils are thinner, as I said, space. And so opening up to that invitation and maybe even loudly say, please come to visit. I personally, my father died, and he still is, it's been a few years, but he still hasn't come for his dream visit with me to say goodbye. Maybe he hasn't said goodbye. But I think if he would have come to me to just make that final connection, and I'm still praying for that to happen, I think it would create a healing in my life. And so making this time of year to do that could be an opportunity for you to do some healing as well. So these are just some things about fall. It is about letting things go. It is about looking at what's that wall is. And the one thing else I do want to say about that wall is when people do show up and they haven't resolved things. And I really want to emphasize this because this is really a cue in for me when I'm working with people, is that they'll tell me that they're stuck, that they can't move forward, they can't get a job, they can't get into a relationship, they can't do anything, or they will do something and it falls apart right away. Well, that's a clue that the lung energy needs to get moved out, because it's blocking the heart's ability to make connections as well as to attract things into a person's life. So those are some of the key issues. I will say in 5-element theory, the more you understand, the more complex it gets. And I certainly haven't touched upon everything in the 5-element theory for lungs and fall. One other thing I do want to say, though, because I don't want to just talk about all the negative things, because the idea about 5-element theory is it's also an opportunity when these negative things show up to make things get transmuted into some kind of a wisdom in your life. And I talked about my father. I've had quite a few grief experiences, and my father I haven't gotten over. But I had a dog years ago, I'm going to say around 10 years ago now, that I really struggled with my grief over him. And the reason I struggled with it is because I felt really guilty about the way he died. I allowed a person into my life that didn't like animals, and this person fed him grapes, and he was already diabetic, and so the intention was, because of his diabetes, feed him grapes. And I was ignorant on the knowledge that grapes actually cause kidney damage in dogs, and he had a terrible death. He suffered immensely at the end of his life. And anyway, I went into this terrible grief over his death. And the thing about grief, again, is it's not just sadness. There's a rage. And there's also, for people, there's this sense that the world is just not real. Part of that rage also, I think, that anger, is recognizing that you have absolutely no control in your life about losing things. And so somehow, though, with all of that overwhelming sensory information, you do have to figure out a way to come out of that. And grief dealing with that can take years, can take a whole lifetime for some people, and giving yourself permission to be gentle with yourself and understand that it will take quite a while when that was a true heart connection for you is the first step in understanding and healing yourself, that and recognizing that you really had the ability to truly love another being. So powerful, just having that recognition. But with this dog, Andy, when that experience went on for me, I felt very ungrounded because he was my buddy. But the way I finally did work out a lot of it really had nothing to do with me going to talk to a therapist about grief. What I ended up doing was just taking all of that energy that felt really stuck and channeling it into something that really didn't have anything necessarily to do with Andy. But what I ended up doing during that time was really doing my research on the 5-element theory. I just really went in depth. I stepped away from the world and I just dove in and really wanted to get a truer understanding, and I did a great deal of writing, and I created more information for my courses during that time. That's how it served me. But what I want to say about that is, if you're feeling stuck, then that's telling me also that you're probably feeling passionateless about what's going on in your life. And I would suggest, without any expectation of the outcome of anything, if you used to love to color or draw or read or do writing, anything that's creative that you once were drawn to start small if you need to, but to try to use those things to channel that energy and to revive that passion in your life. For me, what ended up happening also is that it gave me a deeper sense of understanding the death of Andy and how important he was in my life. Not because I was having direct communication about it, but just in the learning that I was exploring, it kind of put the pieces of a puzzle together that I wouldn't have necessarily been able to do before his death. So that's my experience, but everybody is different. But I do think that trying to find those ways, once again, not to deny the loss, you will never forget it. Trust me, you never will. But to take that energy and channel it into a higher frequency, and so that you can open your heart again and make a connection again in this world. And once that happens, what's going to happen for you is that connection is going to give you that compassion for others, which is really lacking in this world right now on so many levels. But it's going to give you that deeper sense of understanding when somebody else is suffering, and maybe give you the ability to allow somebody to communicate and share their grief in a very matter-of-fact way with you, where you're not so uncomfortable in hearing about it. So anyway, this is all I need to say about it for now. And if you are interested in learning more about the 5 elements and my mentorship program, then feel free to reach out to me. My website link, centerforsacredtransformation.org, is in the description of this video on YouTube. And if you're looking for healing over your own grief, there are some very powerful spiritual practices that can help you move out that energy, as well as getting energy work. So if you're interested, feel free to give me a call. I'm Sara Burns, and I hope that you found meaningful information in this video today. And if you're a healer, I hope it leads you to a deeper practice in your own healing business. So take care and have a beautiful day. Bye-bye.